Have you ever had the feeling of remembering something that hasn't happened yet? That strange sensation that a scene, a conversation, or even an entire event has already passed through your mind before, even knowing rationally that this is impossible. It's not a simple hunch, nor exactly a classic déjà vu. It's as if your brain had registered the future as a memory, and now it's swearing that it already existed before it happened. If this has ever happened to you, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. This experience is more common than it seems. Many people describe this phenomenon as a strangely familiar anticipation, a feeling of certainty that arises out of nowhere. You can't explain where it came from, but it's there. Strong. Convincing. Sometimes it appears seconds before something happens. Sometimes only afterward, when the brain says, "I already knew." And that's precisely where the mystery lies. Did the brain really predict the future? Or is it confusing prediction with memory? What's most intriguing is that this sensation isn't accompanied by conscious effort. You weren't actively thinking about what was going to happen, you weren't planning, nor imagining scenarios. It simply happens. And when it happens, the brain doesn't question it. It accepts it. It feels familiarity. And this familiarity is powerful because the brain deeply trusts it. That's why so many people are disconcerted when they experience this kind of thing. It doesn't seem like a mistake. It seems like a silent certainty. Have you ever experienced this? That phrase someone says and, in that same instant, you feel like you've heard it before, not in exact words but as if the meaning is already registered. Or that unexpected event that, when it happens, awakens the unsettling feeling of, "This was already on my mind." The curious thing is that this feeling comes loaded with emotion. It's not neutral. It brings surprise, strangeness, sometimes even a slight discomfort. Because deep down, it touches something essential, our trust in our own memory. We like to believe that remembering is something solid, reliable, almost like accessing a file stored in the brain. But what if this trust is misplaced? What if, at certain times, the brain isn't remembering something that happened, but reinterpreting something it only predicted? This possibility completely changes how we understand strange experiences of the human brain. And more than that, it reveals a hidden working of the mind that we almost never perceive in our daily lives. The human brain is not a passive observer of reality. It is constantly trying to anticipate the next second, the next movement, the next word. It silently constructs hypotheses, simulates possible futures, and adjusts our reactions even before anything happens. But this process is so fast, so automatic, that it usually goes unnoticed. Until something goes wrong. Or rather, until it works too well. And that's where the strange phenomenon arises, when a prediction happens so subtly that it doesn't enter consciousness, but leaves a mark. When the real event finally occurs, the brain finds that mark and interprets it in the only way that makes sense to it, as a memory. Not as a prediction. Not as a simulation. But as something that already existed before. And this confusion is incredibly convincing. What's most unsettling is realizing that this feeling doesn't depend on mysticism or special powers. It stems from real mechanisms, deeply studied by neuroscience, linked to how the brain constructs meaning, familiarity, and certainty. And understanding this can change how you see your own memories, your intuitions, and even that strange feeling of, "I already knew." Stay with me because from here on out we're going to delve deeper into this territory where prediction and memory intertwine, and what you're about to discover may make you rethink experiences that have always seemed inexplicable. And perhaps the most interesting thing about all this is realizing that these experiences don't happen in a vacuum. They touch something deep because they challenge how we trust our own minds. When the brain confuses prediction with memory, it's not just making a small technical error, it's showing us how the reality we feel is often an internal construct. And that can be fascinating, or disturbing. It depends on how you look at it. If this topic makes sense to you, stop for a moment and think, has this ever happened to me? Perhaps not exactly in the same way, perhaps in different details, but that strange feeling of out-of-place familiarity. If anything said so far has touched you, leave your experience, what you felt, or even your question in the comments. When you share this, you're not just commenting on a video, you're helping to show that this phenomenon is more common than it seems, and that many people experience it in silence, thinking they're the only ones. If this type of content captivates you, makes you reflect, and encourages you to look at the human brain with more curiosity, liking the video makes more of a difference than it seems. It's this simple gesture that signals that it's worthwhile to continue bringing up topics like this, exploring the mysteries of the mind in an accessible, profound, and honest way. Your like helps the video reach people who may also be trying to understand similar experiences. Now, if you feel you want to continue this journey, exploring strange brain phenomena, scientific curiosities, and those subtle flaws of the mind that almost no one explains, subscribe to the channel. It's not just a button. It's a way of saying, this matters to me, and that's exactly what keeps this space alive, growing, and reaching more people interested in understanding what goes on inside their own heads. Your participation here creates a kind of silent community, where every comment, every like, every subscription helps open up space for conversations that don't normally happen in everyday life. And the more people join this conversation, the deeper we can go. Because from this point on, the question is no longer whether the brain makes mistakes. It is, why does he do it in such a convincing way? And what happens when prediction and memory begin to mix without us realizing it? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what we're talking about here isn't a rare, isolated phenomenon, or one reserved for sensitive people. On the contrary, this happens all the time with ordinary people, in absolutely banal situations, so banal that they often go unnoticed. And perhaps that's precisely why this phenomenon is so powerful. It hides in the background of our minds, influencing decisions, shaping how we interpret the world, and reinforcing certainties that aren't always true. Think about how many times you've said almost automatically, I knew this was going to happen. Not after deep analysis, not after elaborate reasoning. You simply said it. Sometimes with surprise, sometimes with a strange sense of confirmation. Or that other, even more common phrase, this had already crossed my mind. When you say that, it's like accessing a memory. Something stored away. Something that was there before. But the unsettling detail is that, most of the time, you can't pinpoint when you thought of it or in what context or why. The feeling comes without proof. It just comes. And the brain accepts it. It doesn't demand evidence. It works with internal coherence. If something makes sense after it happens, the brain tends to fit it into the narrative of its own story. That's how it maintains a sense of control, of continuity, of identity. After all, imagining that we were completely surprised by the world all the time would be psychologically unbearable. So the brain creates shortcuts, small functional illusions, convenient truths. This strange phenomenon that everyone has experienced has nothing mystical about it, at least not in a supernatural sense. It doesn't require special gifts, nor access to a parallel reality. What it requires is simply a human brain functioning exactly as it was designed to function, anticipating, simulating, predicting. The problem is that we have been taught to trust memory too much, as if it were a faithful record of the past. And we almost never stop to question how much it is also influenced by the future that the brain tried to predict. In everyday life, this manifests in subtle ways. You quickly imagine how a conversation might end, but you don't even realize you've done it. When the conversation ends exactly that way, or similarly, a feeling of familiarity arises. The brain says, this isn't new. But it is. The event is new. What isn't new is the silent prediction that happened behind the scenes of the mind. But instead of being recognized as a prediction, it's reinterpreted as a memory. And this confusion changes everything. The most curious thing is that this feeling doesn't come alone. It's usually accompanied by a false sense of security. A confidence that seems solid, but which wasn't built on facts, but rather on emotional coherence. That's where the real impact of this phenomenon comes in. Because when the brain confuses prediction with memory, it's not just playing with time. It's influencing how you make decisions, how you evaluate your past choices, and how you build your own mindset. How many times have you looked at a difficult situation and thought, deep down, I always knew this would go wrong? That phrase carries enormous weight. It rewrites the story. It transforms uncertainty into destiny. And that has a direct impact on how you learn from the experience, or fail to learn. Because if you always knew, then there wasn't much you could do. There were no alternatives. There was no possible transformation. The brain closes the loop and moves on, satisfied with its own narrative. But behind this lies a hidden truth. The brain doesn't necessarily want objective truth. It wants predictability. It wants meaning. It wants to maintain a coherent internal narrative, even if that requires distorting the timeline. And that's why this phenomenon is so common and, at the same time, so invisible. It doesn't attract attention because it seems logical. It seems natural. It seems normal. But when you start observing this process more closely, something changes. You begin to realize how much of your mental journey is constructed after the facts, not before. How much of your certainties are, in fact, reconstructions. And this is not a flaw in the brain. It's a characteristic, a strategy, a way to survive in a complex, unpredictable world full of variables. This revelation may be uncomfortable at first because it challenges the idea of control. But it can also be liberating. Because if many of your memories of certainty, were born from unconscious predictions, then perhaps you are not trapped by them. Perhaps there is more room for revision, for a change of mindset, for more conscious choices. Perhaps understanding this mechanism is an important step towards seeing your own mind more clearly, not as an enemy, but as a system trying to do the best it can with incomplete information. And the more you pay attention to it, the more you realize that this phenomenon is not isolated. It connects with other strange effects of the human brain: the sensation of déjà vu, false memories, over-reliance on intuition, the tendency to find meaning where perhaps there is only coincidence. All of this is part of the same backdrop. The same deep mechanism that mixes past, present, and future into a single subjective experience. Now, when you start observing these situations with this new perspective, something interesting happens. That automatic phrase, "I knew this was going to happen," no longer sounds so simple. It becomes an invitation to reflection. A small warning. A sign that perhaps the brain is trying to protect a narrative, and not necessarily reveal the truth. And that's exactly where this conversation begins to take on another dimension, because understanding this process isn't just scientific curiosity. It's self-knowledge. It has a real impact on how you interpret your own story. If this point has already started to resonate within you, if any specific memory has surfaced while you were listening to this, write a simple sentence in the comments. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because to understand why the brain confuses prediction with memory, we need to confront a silent error that happens all the time, and that almost no one notices. An error that doesn't sound like an error. An error that, in fact, seems like efficiency. The brain doesn't live exactly in the present as we like to imagine. It lives a few milliseconds ahead, trying to guess what comes next, adjusting responses, preparing reactions, anticipating scenarios. The present, for the brain, is almost always a delayed detail. This happens because the real world is too fast. If the brain waited for everything to happen before reacting, we would always be at a disadvantage. So it does what it does best. It predicts. It calculates probabilities, cross-references past experiences, detects minute patterns, and creates hypotheses about the next second. This process happens behind the scenes, outside of our conscious awareness. You don't feel the brain predicting. You only feel the final sensation: familiarity, certainty. I've seen this before. And here's the hidden truth that changes everything. The brain wasn't designed to faithfully record reality like a camera or a recorder. It was shaped to keep you alive, functional, and coherent within a personal narrative. That's why it prioritizes predictability over accuracy. It prefers a story that makes sense to an exact portrayal of the facts. And this choice has a profound impact on how you perceive time, memory, and even your own identity. When something happens, the brain immediately compares the real event with the predictions it has been simulating. If there is a match, even a vague one, that strange feeling of recognition arises. It's not that you consciously remember the prediction. Most of the time you don't even know it existed. But the brain knows. And it interprets this match as a memory. Not as a previous hypothesis, but as something that was already there. This is the silent error. The prediction isn't registered as a prediction. It's reused as a memory. And because the feeling of familiarity is so strong, the brain doesn't question its origin. It simply fits the event into the internal narrative and moves on. This saves energy, reduces uncertainty, and maintains a sense of control. From a biological point of view, it's a brilliant strategy. From the point of view of consciousness, it's a constant source of confusion. That's why we so often feel like we already knew something, even without being able to explain how or when that knowledge arose. There wasn't a clear moment of decision, nor an articulated thought. The brain did the work alone, behind the scenes, and then delivered only the final result to us. And as human beings, we tend to trust that result because it comes loaded with emotional conviction. It sounds true. It seems solid. But that doesn't mean it's true to reality. This dynamic directly influences our mindset. When the brain transforms predictions into memories, it reinforces the idea that we are more predictable, more consistent, and more certain than we actually are. It builds an internal image of someone who has always been in control, even when that's not true. And this image affects future decisions because we begin to trust our intuitions more, even when they stem from unconscious shortcuts. The curious thing is that this mechanism doesn't only fail in trivial situations. It acts during important moments in our journey: career choices, relationships, breakups, changes of direction. After something happens, the brain quickly reorganizes the past so that the outcome seems inevitable. It erases doubts, softens contradictions, and highlights signs that were previously irrelevant. The result is a clean, coherent, and deceptive memory. But this doesn't happen out of malice. There's no deceiver inside the head. There's a system trying to protect psychological stability. A brain that prefers a continuous narrative to a chaotic mosaic of uncertainties. But this protection comes at a cost. The cost is believing that we remember accurately when, in fact, we are reinterpreting. That we recall when, often, we are merely recognizing something the brain tried to predict. This perception completely changes how we view strange experiences of the human brain. That feeling of déjà vu ceases to be just a curious mystery and becomes a symptom of something bigger. The brain's difficulty in distinguishing what was experienced from what was simulated. Because, for it, both use very similar pathways. Both serve the same purpose, to prepare you to act. And when you start to see this clearly, something interesting happens. You begin to distrust absolute certainties a little more. You start to question that automatic feeling of, I always knew. Not to devalue yourself but to become more aware. More attentive to the inner workings of your own mind. This change of perspective can be profoundly transformative because it opens up space for revision, learning, and choices more aligned with reality, and not just with the narrative that the brain constructed after the fact. The brain is an extraordinary machine, but it's not an impartial historian. It's an editor. It cuts, adjusts, rearranges, and fills in gaps. And it does this with such skill that we almost never perceive the process. We only feel the final result, a story that seems to make sense. A comfortable story. A story that protects the ego and reduces the feeling of chaos. Now, when you observe this process closely, you begin to notice small cracks in this narrative. Moments when certainty arises too quickly. Situations where familiarity appears without context. Sensations of recognition that are not accompanied by clear memories. These are the points where prediction and memory meet, mix, and become confused. And it is precisely at these points that the brain reveals more about itself. If this explanation has sparked some quiet reflection within you, if you've realized that many of your certainties may have stemmed from this subtle confusion between predicting and remembering, write a simple sentence in the comments, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because to truly understand how the brain confuses prediction with memory, we need to look more closely at something that happens even before any memory exists. The brain creates the future before it happens. This is not a metaphor nor poetic exaggeration. It's basic functioning. While you believe you are merely reacting to the world, the brain is already several steps ahead, constructing possible versions of what is about to happen, even if you don't realize it. This process begins simply. From past experiences, the brain learns patterns. Tones of voice, facial expressions, sequences of events, social contexts, physical environments. All of this becomes raw material for anticipation. When you enter a place, the brain is already predicting the mood of the conversation. When someone starts a sentence, it mentally rehearses possible endings. When a situation repeats itself even minimally, the brain doesn't wait to see the outcome. It simulates it. These simulations are not conscious thoughts. You don't hear an inner voice saying, this will happen. They occur behind the scenes in the deep layers of the mind, where perception, expectation, and action intertwine. The brain silently tests scenarios, assesses risks, rehearses emotional responses, and prepares the body to react. All this in fractions of a second. The future, in this sense, already exists as a possibility before it becomes reality. The most curious thing is that the brain doesn't just simulate one scenario. It creates several at the same time. Small versions of the future compete for space. What could go right, what could go wrong, what seems most likely, what would be safest. But only some of these simulations gain enough strength to leave a mark. And when one of these predictions comes too close to what actually happens, that strange feeling of recognition arises. Not because you remembered, but because the brain recognized a correspondence between what was simulated and what came true. This is where the confusion begins. The brain doesn't clearly separate what was experienced from what was automatically imagined. For it, both serve the same purpose, to reduce uncertainty. If a simulation matches reality, it ceases to be seen as a hypothesis and begins to be reinterpreted as a memory. There's no alarm saying, that was just a prediction. There's only a feeling of familiarity, of coherence, of, this makes sense. And that feeling is too powerful to be ignored. From a scientific point of view, this makes perfect sense. The areas of the brain involved in imagining the future are very similar to the areas involved in remembering the past. The brain reuses circuits. It saves resources. It doesn't build separate systems for each function. And this creates an inevitable overlap. When you imagine something with rich detail, the brain activates patterns similar to those of a real memory. Now imagine this happening automatically, quickly, and outside of conscious awareness. The boundary between prediction and memory becomes blurred. This mechanism explains why so many expectations seem obvious after the facts unfold. After the future becomes the present, the brain reorganizes the internal narrative so that everything seems logical, predictable, almost inevitable. It adjusts the past to protect the feeling of continuity. And this reorganization has a direct impact on how you interpret your own journey. Difficult decisions seem simpler afterward. Mistakes seem more predictable. Successes seem more intentional. The brain likes this narrative because it sustains a mindset of control. Even when reality was chaotic, uncertain, or unexpected, the brain finds a way to say, deep down, this was already clear. This phrase is not just an opinion. It's a reconstruction. An edit of the story made after the events. And the more convincing this edit, the more it shapes future decisions, reinforcing confidence and intuitions that didn't always stem from conscious analysis. This anticipatory creation of the future also explains why certain revelations seem so emotionally impactful. When something happens exactly as the brain simulated, even without your knowledge, a silent shock arises. It's not pure surprise. It's a mixture of confirmation and strangeness. Something inside you recognizes the event, but can't explain where that recognition comes from. This is the hidden truth behind many experiences we call strange. They don't come from nowhere. They come from unseen predictions that have come to life. And the more you understand this process, the more you realize it's not limited to specific situations. It permeates everything. Conversations, choices, expectations, fears, hopes. The brain is constantly projecting versions of tomorrow, and these projections influence how you act today. They shape posture, tone of voice, subtle decisions. And when one of these projections comes true, the brain quickly incorporates it as part of your story, as if it had always been there. This realization can be profoundly transformative, because it reveals that many of our certainties are not signs of extraordinary foresight, but results of a highly efficient system attempting to make sense of the flow of time. This does not diminish human intelligence. On the contrary, it shows how sophisticated the mechanism that sustains our conscious experiences, but it also shows its limits. It shows that confidence is not synonymous with truth. That familiarity does not guarantee accuracy. When you start observing this more closely, something changes in how you relate to your own decisions. You begin to realize that not every certainty needs to be followed blindly. That not every feeling of already knowing is a reliable guide. This opens up space for more conscious choices, for honest revisions, and for a more mature relationship with your own mind. It's a change in mindset that doesn't come from denying the brain, but from understanding how it really works. And the deeper you delve into this understanding, the clearer it becomes that this anticipation mechanism is only a part of something much bigger. Because if the brain creates the future before it exists, what happens when this creation fails? What happens when predictions conflict with reality? And how does the brain deal with these silent discrepancies that rarely reach consciousness? If this reflection has already begun to resonate within you, write a simple sentence in the comments, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a specific, and extremely subtle, point where all of this takes on even more intriguing contours. It's the moment when the prediction happens, but nobody notices. There's no warning. There's no clear feeling. There's no formulated thought. The brain simply does what it always does, anticipates. Only this time, it does it too quickly, too quietly, too efficiently for consciousness to register the process. This is one of the most fascinating behind-the-scenes aspects of the human mind. While you believe you are simply living in the present, your brain has already run microsimulations of what might happen next. Not complete versions, not detailed scenes like a movie. They are fragments, fine adjustments, small fittings of expectation. Enough to prepare you but not enough to capture your conscious attention. And that's precisely why these predictions disappear from your perception as soon as they appear. The curious thing is that these predictions aren't stored as thoughts. They aren't readily available for consultation. They don't enter the same system where narratable memories are stored. They remain in an intermediate, functional, and transient layer. They serve their purpose at that moment, preparing the brain, and were then discarded. At least that's what it seems. Because when reality unfolds in a way similar to that silent prediction, something strange is activated. The brain recognizes the pattern. It perceives that what is happening now matches something that has already been processed before. But since the prediction wasn't registered as a prediction, there's no clear reference to its origin. So the brain does what it does best. It interprets. It seeks an explanation that maintains internal coherence. And the simplest, most comfortable and quickest explanation is, I remember this. This feeling isn't accompanied by clear images of the past. There's no specific moment to point to. There's no detailed memory. There's only certainty. A silent, almost automatic certainty. And that certainty is enough to convince. Because the brain deeply trusts this kind of internal signal. It doesn't need proof. It works with a sense of familiarity. Something sounds familiar, then it must have happened before. At least that's what the system assumes. This is how a forgotten prediction transforms into a false, yet extremely convincing memory. Not false in the sense of being deliberately invented, but false in the sense of being reinterpreted. The origin was a simulation of the future. The destination became a memory of the past. And in the midst of all this, consciousness was completely left out of the process. You only receive the final result, already edited, already fitted into the narrative of your life. This mechanism explains why many people describe these experiences as something difficult to put into words. They feel that something doesn't quite fit, but they can't quite put their finger on what. There's a slight friction between certainty and lack of evidence. Between I remember and but I don't know from where. This friction is the trace left by the prediction that happened too quickly to be noticed. From the mind's point of view, this is extremely efficient. It makes no sense to overload consciousness with all the predictions the brain generates. It would be chaotic. It would be paralyzing. So the brain filters. It only brings to consciousness what it considers relevant at the moment. The rest happens behind the scenes, off the main stage. The problem is that sometimes these behind-the-scenes events reappear later, disguised as memories. And this has a profound impact on how we interpret our own history. Because when we believe we remember something that, in fact, we only predicted, we reinforce a sense of retrospective control. The past seems more organized. Decisions seem more obvious. The journey seems more linear. And this linearity is comfortable. It protects identity. It sustains the mindset that everything made sense from the beginning. But this is a hidden truth that deserves to be faced more honestly. Much of the clarity we feel about the past didn't exist at the time we were living through those situations. It was built afterward. Adjusted. Polished. And the brain does this not to deceive, but to preserve emotional stability. To reduce the impact of chance. To transform uncertainty into narrative. When you understand this, you begin to realize how much this mechanism influences future decisions. Because if you believe you always knew, you tend to trust more blindly in future certainties. If you believe your predictions usually come true, you question them less. And this shapes behavior, choices, and even how you interpret mistakes and successes. The forgotten prediction becomes a memory. The memory becomes identity. And identity begins to guide new decisions. This cycle is powerful. It creates a sense of internal continuity that is rarely interrupted. But when it is, it generates those strange experiences we call human brain phenomena. Moments when something seems out of place. When time seems to fold back on itself. When the future seems to echo the past. Not because something supernatural is happening, but because the brain is dealing with its own simulations in a way that is too creative. This revelation may cause some discomfort at first. After all, questioning one's own memory is questioning one of the pillars of identity. But it can also be profoundly liberating. Because realizing that many certainties were born from unseen predictions opens up space for more mental flexibility. For more curiosity. For a less rigid relationship with one's own thinking. It's a silent, but real, transformation in how you observe yourself from within. And the more you pay attention to it, the more you start to notice these moments in everyday life. Small instants when the feeling of "I've seen this before" arises without context. Situations where certainty comes before explanation. Emotional reactions that seem too quick to have been thought through. All of this is a clue to this deep workings. This brain that is always working a few steps ahead, even when you believe you are only reacting. Now, when you start putting all these pieces together, the silent prediction, the automatic simulation, the reconstructed memory, something even more interesting begins to emerge. Because if the brain can transform predictions into memories without you realizing it, then there is a very delicate boundary between what you have experienced and what your mind has merely tried to anticipate. And it is precisely on this boundary that some of the most intriguing experiences of human consciousness arise. If this idea resonated with you, write a simple word in the comments, "I recognized." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where the real mental click of this video happens. It's the point where everything starts to fit together in an almost uncomfortable, yet extremely revealing way. The brain confuses prediction with memory not out of carelessness, not out of gross error, but because, for it, these two things are born much closer than we imagine. They use similar pathways, activate similar neural networks, and ultimately serve the same purpose: to give meaning to the chaotic flow of human experience. When you remember something, the brain doesn't rewind a tape. It reconstructs it. It activates patterns, fills in gaps, rearranges details, and creates a coherent version of that event. When you anticipate something, the process is surprisingly similar. The brain uses past experiences, associated emotions, similar contexts, and projects future possibilities. Behind the scenes, the mechanism is almost the same. What changes is the label that consciousness applies afterward. That's why the feeling of familiarity is so deceptive. Familiarity isn't proof that something happened before. It's merely a sign that that pattern has already passed through the brain in some way. And that some way might have been a silent prediction, an automatic simulation, an expectation created in milliseconds and discarded immediately afterward. But when the real event happens, that familiarity reappears, strong, convincing, almost impossible to ignore. The brain feels, this isn't new. And that feeling is enough. At that moment, the brain doesn't stop to ask if that was experienced or just imagined. It doesn't investigate the origin. It doesn't audit the past. It does something much simpler and more efficient. It tries to maintain the coherence of the internal story. And this is where the key phrase comes in that completely changes the way we see this phenomenon. The brain doesn't ask, did this happen? It asks, does this make sense? If it makes sense within the narrative, it accepts it. If it fits well, it incorporates it. This detail has a huge impact on how time is perceived internally. Because for the brain, the timeline is not fixed. It is malleable. It can be adjusted to preserve meaning. When a forgotten prediction encounters a real event, the brain can simply shift that prediction back in the narrative, transforming it into a memory. Not consciously, not deliberately, but as an automatic, behind-the-scenes adjustment. The past is rewritten so that the present seems less arbitrary. This process happens all the time on a small scale. They aren't major cinematic distortions. They're micro-edits. Small adjustments that go unnoticed, but which, added up over a lifetime, shape how you believe you've always thought, always felt, always known. The identity you build is, in part, a result of these silent rewrites. And this isn't a flaw in the system. It's a characteristic. The brain does this because the alternative would be to live in constant disruption. Imagine remembering with complete precision all the doubts you had before each decision. Imagine reliving with clarity all the uncertainty, all the fear, all the ambiguity. It would be exhausting. So the brain simplifies. It clears the path. It transforms chaos into narrative. It creates a sense of continuity that sustains the mindset and allows it to move forward. The problem is that this efficiency comes at a price. The price is believing that we remember better than we actually do. That our certainties were always there. That our predictions were clear from the start. When, in fact, many of them were built later from diffuse signals, vague emotions, and quick simulations that never reached consciousness. Prediction becomes memory. Memory becomes certainty. Certainty becomes the basis for new decisions. This dynamic directly influences how you interpret mistakes and successes. A success seems inevitable in retrospect. A mistake seems obvious after it happens. The brain reorganizes the facts so that everything seems logical. And this affects learning. Because learning requires recognizing uncertainty. It requires accepting that we didn't know. But if the brain rewrites the story to say, deep down I already knew, the learning becomes superficial. The transformation becomes limited. Upon realizing this, something changes in the way you observe your own mind. You begin to notice that not all certainty deserves absolute trust. That not every feeling of familiarity indicates truth. That many convictions are merely the result of an extremely competent brain trying to maintain internal coherence. This realization doesn't weaken you. On the contrary, it strengthens you. Because it brings awareness to processes that previously operated automatically. And the more aware you are of these behind-the-scenes aspects, the more freedom you gain to revise decisions, adjust your mindset, and question internal narratives that seemed immutable. You begin to understand that the journey is not a straight line built from the beginning, but a constantly edited story. And this changes the impact that the past has on the present. The past ceases to be an absolute judge and becomes a version, useful, functional, but not definitive. This understanding also helps explain why certain experiences of the human brain are so disturbing. They mess with this edited timeline. They expose the stitching. They show that what seems solid is, in fact, flexible. And when the stitching appears, we feel strange. Because something that sustained our sense of control is briefly revealed as a construct. Not a false one, but a constructed one. By accepting this, you don't lose your identity. You gain depth. You begin to see your own inner revelations as processes, not as absolute truths. And this opens up space for a more honest relationship with your own mind. A less rigid, less defensive, more curious relationship. Because understanding that the brain rewrites the timeline doesn't diminish the human experience, it expands it. And as this understanding deepens, a silent question begins to echo. If so many memories carry traces of forgotten predictions, how many certainties that today seem solid were actually born from invisible simulations? This question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It merely creates an internal space. A space where curiosity begins to replace automatic certainty. And it is in this space that other layers of this phenomenon begin to reveal themselves. If this made you pause for a second and rethink a memory, write it in the comments. That really affected me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where familiarity takes on a central and dangerous role in all of this. Familiarity is one of the most powerful sensations the brain can produce. It comes before logic, before analysis, before any conscious verification. When something seems familiar, the brain relaxes. It interprets this as a sign of security, of predictability, of control. And that is precisely why familiarity can deceive so easily. When the brain confuses prediction with memory, familiarity emerges as a kind of seal of authenticity. It doesn't matter if you can remember when you thought of it, it doesn't matter if there's a clear memory associated with it. The feeling of "this isn't new" is enough to generate conviction. And this conviction doesn't present itself as doubt. It presents itself as certainty. A silent certainty but extremely persuasive. This is where many people describe the experience as déjà vu. But in reality, what's happening goes beyond classic déjà vu. It's not just the feeling of having already lived that scene. It's the feeling that the brain knew it was going to happen. An anticipation that seems almost supernatural. And the stronger the familiarity, the easier it is to interpret it as special intuition, a sixth sense, or even some form of perception beyond the ordinary. The problem isn't in feeling it. The problem is in blindly believing it. Because the brain doesn't differentiate at the sensory level between a real memory and a successful prediction. Both can generate the same feeling of certainty. Both can seem equally true. And that's where false confidence in one's own memories is born. The person not only believes they remembered, they fully trust that memory, even without being able to support it with concrete details. This false confidence has a profound impact on how we interpret our own minds. When we believe too much in familiarity, we begin to overestimate our predictive capacity. We start to believe that we always knew, that we felt it beforehand, that something warned us. And this reinforces an internal narrative of control and clarity that doesn't always correspond to reality. The mind feels safe, but this security can be illusory. This is how beliefs in supernatural intuition arise. Not because people are inventing something, but because they are interpreting real sensations of familiarity as external or special signs. The brain recognizes a pattern, generates a silent prediction, and when that prediction is confirmed, familiarity comes into play and seals the experience as something extraordinary. But behind the scenes, the process was purely cognitive. Extremely sophisticated, yes, but human. The subtle danger here is that feeling certain doesn't mean being right. This is one of the most uncomfortable revelations about how the mind works. The feeling of certainty is just that, a feeling. It doesn't, in itself, guarantee truth. The brain can generate certainty from incomplete information, quick predictions, or later reconstructions. And because this certainty comes from within, we tend to trust it more than external data. This excessive confidence in one's own memories affects important decisions. When someone believes they remember accurately, they tend to defend their version of events more rigidly. Discussions turn into conflicts. Opinions become absolute truths. The brain protects the narrative it has constructed because it sustains identity. Admitting that memory might be wrong is threatening. It means admitting that one's own internal history may have been edited. And the more familiarity reinforces this narrative, the harder it becomes to question it. The brain prefers a comfortable explanation to an open doubt. It prefers a false certainty to an honest uncertainty. This is a functional choice, but one that limits transformation. Because transformation requires recognizing gray areas, gaps, flaws in perception. It requires accepting that not everything that seems clear really is. Throughout anyone's life journey, this mechanism accumulates. Small false certainties add up. Small edits to memory become consolidated. And over time they create a worldview that seems solid, but is built on cognitive shortcuts. This doesn't mean that everything we remember is wrong. It only means that not everything we remember is as reliable as we feel it is. When you start observing this more closely, you realize that many of the strange experiences of the human brain revolve around this same axis. Familiarity without a clear origin. The feeling of déjà vu. The conviction that something had to happen. The impression that a decision was obvious from the beginning. All of this shares the same backdrop. A brain that works too fast, too well, and then rearranges the story to maintain coherence. This perception changes your relationship with your own mind. Instead of treating every feeling of certainty as absolute truth, you begin to see it as a signal to be investigated. An invitation to curiosity, not to immediate conclusions. This doesn't weaken intuition. On the contrary, it makes intuition more conscious, less automatic, less hostage to internal illusions. And it is at this point that something begins to shift internally. Familiarity ceases to be proof. Certainty ceases to be the final point. Memory ceases to be an untouchable record and begins to be seen as a dynamic construction. This shift doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually as you recognize these patterns in your daily life. Small situations. Small reactions. Small moments when the brain seems to know too much. Now, when you put all of this together, silent prediction, deceptive familiarity, false certainty, a deeper understanding of the real impact of this phenomenon begins to emerge. Not just as a scientific curiosity, but as something that influences choices, mindset, and how you position yourself in relation to your own past. Because questioning familiarity is, at its core, questioning how much of your own history has been reconstructed to make sense. And this question, when it arises, doesn't demand an immediate answer. It simply opens up space. A space where other revelations begin to emerge, showing that perhaps the brain isn't interested in preserving what happened, but in sustaining what seems coherent. If this resonated with you in any way, write it in the comments. Certainty is not truth. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because all of this reveals something much bigger about our minds, something that goes beyond scientific curiosity and directly touches on how each of us constructs our own identity. When we understand that the brain confuses prediction with memory, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Our memory is not an archive. It is not an organized shelf where facts are stored waiting to be accessed. It is a continuous reconstruction, shaped at every moment by what we expect, by what we feel, and by the meaning we try to give to our own story. Every time you remember something, your brain doesn't open an intact drawer from the past. It assembles a version. It combines real fragments with inferences, current emotions, future expectations, and narratives that make sense now. The past isn't just retrieved, it's reinterpreted. And this reconstruction doesn't happen by chance. It happens because the brain needs to maintain a sense of coherence between who you were, who you are, and who you believe you will be. This completely changes how we view past decisions. What seems obvious, clear, and inevitable today was rarely so at the time it happened. At the moment of choice there was doubt. There was fear. There was ambiguity. But the brain doesn't like to leave these marks open. So it softens the past, removes rough edges, and creates a cleaner narrative line. A line where decisions seem more rational, more aligned, more conscious than they actually were. This reconstruction directly influences mindset. When you believe you always knew what you were doing, you tend to trust your current certainties more. When you believe that deep down you always felt it, you begin to treat intuitions as solid truths. The brain reinforces this image because it protects the sense of identity. Admitting that many decisions were made blindly threatens the idea of control. So the mind adjusts the story to preserve emotional stability. But there is a silent impact in all of this. If memory is influenced by what we expect and not just by what we experience, then the way you imagine the future begins to shape the past. Future expectations retroactively influence old memories. Unfulfilled projects, current fears, unmet desires. All of this can alter how you recall past events. The past ceases to be fixed and becomes dynamic, constantly revisited through new lenses. This has profound consequences for the perception of reality. Because if the brain reconstructs the past to make sense of the present, then what you call lived reality is, in part, a functional narrative. Not a deliberate lie but an adapted version. A story that allows one to move forward without collapsing in the face of chance, unpredictability, and the lack of control that truly mark the human experience. This revelation may be disconcerting. After all, we grow up believing that remembering is something reliable, almost sacred. But realizing that memory is malleable, editable, and influenced by expectations opens up space for a more mature understanding of the mind. An understanding that doesn't romanticize certainty, but values awareness. Because if memory isn't an archive, then identity isn't something fixed either. It is constructed, revised, and adjusted throughout the journey. And that changes everything. It changes how you interpret mistakes. It changes how you deal with regrets. It changes how you take responsibility for past decisions. Instead of punishing yourself for not seeing it sooner, you begin to realize that your brain only made it clear later. Instead of clinging to rigid certainties, you start to see the past as a territory for learning, not judgment. There is a silent transformation that happens when this understanding takes hold. You begin to treat your own memories with more humility, not as absolute truths but as possible versions. This doesn't weaken identity. On the contrary, it makes it more flexible, more open, more capable of evolving. An identity that allows for revision is an identity that grows. This perspective also changes how you relate to other people. Conflicts cease to be merely disputes over who is right. They become encounters of different narratives, each constructed by a brain trying to make sense of its own experience. This generates more empathy, more listening, more space to understand that two people can remember the same event in different ways, and both be sincerely convinced of their versions. Ultimately, what this reveals is that the human mind is not committed to objective truth above all else. It is committed to meaning, to continuity, to emotional survival. The brain prefers a story that makes sense to a fragmented reality. And understanding this doesn't distance us from the truth, it brings us closer to a deeper truth, that human experience is inevitably interpretive. When you accept that memory is a reconstruction influenced by what you expect, what you fear, and what you desire, something shifts internally. The past loses some of its absolute weight. The present gains more space for conscious choices. And the future ceases to be merely an automatic repetition of old narratives. This change in perspective can have a real impact on how you live, decide, and position yourself in relation to your own history. And perhaps it is precisely here that this phenomenon ceases to be merely a curiosity about the brain and becomes a deeper invitation. An invitation to observe more closely how your memories were shaped, how your certainties were constructed, and how your perception of reality has been adjusted over time. Not to distrust everything, but to better understand the inner workings of your own mind. Because when you realize that memory is not a mirror of the past, but a living construct, a silent question begins to emerge. To what extent has what you call who I am been shaped by forgotten predictions, unperceived expectations, and stories rewritten to make sense? This question doesn't need to be answered now. It simply opens up an inner space. A space where other layers of this phenomenon begin to reveal themselves, inviting you to look even deeper. If this passage made you reflect on any memory or decision from your own journey, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when all these layers begin to overlap, prediction, memory, familiarity, certainty, something silent happens within us. It's not an immediate shock. It's more like an internal shift. A feeling that something that always seems solid begins to become a little more flexible. And that's not a loss. It's a gain in awareness. When you look back at your own journey, it's almost inevitable to feel that many things were always clear. That certain paths were obvious. That certain choices made sense from the beginning. But this clarity, more often than not, was born later. It was built little by little, revised, polished, reorganized. The brain took loose fragments, old doubts, silent expectations, and transformed everything into a coherent story. A story that protects identity and sustains the feeling of continuity. And this is not a flaw. It's a mechanism of psychological survival. To live believing that everything was pure chance, that nothing made sense at the moment it happened, would be too much. So the brain does what it does best. It creates meaning. It connects the dots. It smooths over ruptures. It transforms uncertainty into narrative. And in this narrative, forgotten predictions find space to become memories. This is one of the most profound revelations about the human mind. Memory doesn't exist solely to preserve the past. It exists to justify the present, to explain who you are now, to support current decisions. And in this process, the brain doesn't act as an impartial judge of facts, but as a careful editor of its own history. It cuts scenes, rearranges sequences, and adjusts the emotional tone so that everything makes sense today. When you understand this, you begin to look at your own memories with a different kind of attention. Not with aggressive distrust, but with curiosity. You start to realize that some certainties are strong not because they are true, but because they are functional. They help you move forward. To maintain internal coherence. To preserve a stable mindset in the midst of an unpredictable world. And perhaps that's why this phenomenon affects us so much. Because it touches on something essential, the relationship between identity and memory. Who you believe yourself to be is deeply connected to the stories you tell yourself about the past. If these stories are, in part, reconstructions influenced by silent predictions, unperceived expectations and later edits, then identity is also more fluid than it seems. This might be frightening at first, but it can also be liberating. Because if history has been edited, it can be revisited. If memory has been constructed, it can be understood more deeply. This doesn't erase what you've lived through. It doesn't invalidate real emotions. It simply reveals that the mind works with layers, shortcuts, and constant adjustments to maintain balance. There's a real impact all of this has on how you approach future decisions. When you realize that the feeling of "I already knew" often arises afterward, you start to make more room for honest doubt. You become more accepting of not knowing. And that changes your mindset. Because a mind that accepts uncertainty is more open to transformation, more willing to learn, less bound by the need to always be right. Perhaps one of the greatest traps of human consciousness is confusing certainty with truth. The brain produces certainty easily. It's very good at it. But truth is more complex, slower, more uncomfortable. It doesn't always fit perfectly into clean narratives. And that's why it often takes a backseat. The brain prefers what makes sense now to what is absolutely accurate. When you begin to see through this inner game, something changes in how you relate to your own thoughts. You start to listen to your certainties more attentively, but also more carefully. You begin to realize that some convictions are merely attempts by the mind to fill gaps, to reduce anxiety, to maintain a stable narrative amidst the constant flow of experience. And then comes that moment of mental silence. An instant when you don't try to explain everything, nor conclude anything. You simply observe. Observe how certain memories emerge too readily. How some certainties appear too quickly. How familiarity sometimes arrives uninvited. This silence is not emptiness. It is space. Space to perceive the inner workings of one's own mind without the immediate need to label or justify. Perhaps you're not thinking about the future. Perhaps your brain is just trying to prove that it was always right. This phrase doesn't need an answer. It doesn't ask for agreement or rejection. It simply lingers there, echoing, opening a crack. Because when you accept that the brain may be more interested in coherence than in precision, you begin to look at your strange experiences, your intuitions, and even your déjà vu with a different perspective. A more curious, less literal, more conscious perspective. And this awareness doesn't close anything off. On the contrary, it opens up new paths. Because, from this point on, other questions begin to arise naturally. About how these silent predictions influence important choices. About how many decisions were guided by reconstructed certainties. About how much of your journey was shaped by stories that made sense later, and not before. If this lockdown has left a silence inside, the kind that makes you think slowly, comment with a simple word: reflection. If you've made it this far, it's because this topic has resonated with you in some way. It wasn't just curiosity, it was identification, reflection, perhaps even a pleasant discomfort. And that's exactly why this channel exists. To explore the mysteries of the human brain in an honest, profound, and accessible way without ready-made answers, but with questions that make sense. If you feel that this type of content adds value, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to say that you want to continue this journey with me, exploring these revelations that almost no one talks about in everyday life. If this message resonated with you until the end, leave a comment writing, "I'm with you until the end." It's a silent way of showing that this exchange really happened. And if at any point in the video you felt that connection, that "this explains a lot" feeling, a like helps more than it seems. It signals that this type of conversation deserves to continue, to go further, to find other people who also live through these strange experiences of the mind. Now, if you'd like to continue this line of thought, there's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic. Click on it and continue the conversation with me there. The conversation doesn't end here, it just shifts to a new level.